Good afternoon, everybody. Big pleasure to be here. Harry and I are going to do this together, but I will do the first part. Harry will do the second part of what we are going to discuss. And we want to take the discussion from the previous session forward into the area of online impact. I think there's a nice progression in the sessions we've had so far with the local innovative experiences. Then Nick challenging museums also, not just focusing on local experiences, but also about their role in information society, in the networked information society. And I think that's the networked environment is where Harry and I will going to be sharing our ideas and thoughts with you. And a phrase you hear quite often is that we're in a transition, not just cultural heritage institutions. I'm not just addressing museums, we're also addressing archives, libraries with historical collections, archaeology, institutions for monument care, so memory institutions, as we might call them. And we often hear that they're in a transition, and we try to visualize a bit what we meant with that transition. And it goes really back to the 70s or the 80s when ICT emerged for the use. And what we try to visualize here is that when digitization became available, when the technology became available, we used digitization to make things more efficient for the way that we do things, like presenting our collections or cataloging. But what also happened with the technology is that our audiences, our audience also got access to new technology, especially in a networked environment. And from that moment on, things changed quite drastically in the way that we can present ourselves. I think it was also in the previous session. To be noticed is about being relevant. And if you think back some 20, 30 years ago, cultural heritage institutions had quite a strong profile based on authority. I remember when I went to college and I wanted to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France for getting access to their collections, I need a letter from my professor. When I was a student, I could not get access to a memory collection in a library. So we had a very big authority which we could thrive on. And of course what changed, and I think that's the most important change that we are facing, is how do we create that value? How do we make ourselves relevant to the audiences? Local communities, your visitors that come to you in a physical place, but also the tremendous opportunity to engage online with user groups and individuals that you probably don't even conceive that they could be interested in the work that you're doing, in the collections that you have. And so this is our comfort zone, and that's what we are trying to challenge you, try and see the memory institutions to challenge, to come out of that comfort zone. And that comfort zone is very much about quality and supply. That's a really strong asset of what we do. There's a big information soup on the web out there, and what sets us apart is the quality of the information, that people trust that the information that we provide is authentic. Not necessarily true, because libraries don't have a claim on the truth of information in their collections, but at least it's authentic information. They can rely that the sources they have, they are authentic. And in the traditional paradigm, the memory institutions had a lot of expertise about that collections, and that's being challenged more as part of that transformation. We had some examples of crowdsourcing. There's much more knowledge outside our institutions than we can have with our own staff. So the transformation is very much from, say, the more traditional push of knowledge that we had and the authority that we had about our collections to a pool of interaction. And I think that's one of the key strands that links the work that we're doing, that Helena is doing with this conference and that we are doing with our DISH conference as well. It's very much about engagement with communities, for instance, through the social media. Now, what's one of the obstacles from our experience is that we don't really have any good frameworks to judge or to value that transformation. If you talk to, for instance, policymakers at governments or city councils, for them it's much a struggle to keep the pace of this innovation and this change as it is for the institutions. So how do you value, how do you evaluate the activities of institutions that make that change, that make that transformation. And in the past, the valuation was very much based on the reputation, on authority, and now it's very much on performance and impact. And what we will do in the next part of our presentation is present to you and discuss with you 2 instruments that we are set up across Europe, trying to evaluate and assess that transformation from a physical authoritative institution to a networked institution that provides services to create impact and to increase the value for different user groups. So the first part which I will present is Enumerate, that is funded by the European Commission, and it's a framework to collect and also develop a methodology on quantitative information about digital heritage. So how much has been digitized, how much are the digital collections used, how much money is spent across Europe on digital heritage. And I will pick up some of the points that were addressed in the previous session about how do you know your user. I will show you some figures about that. And in the second part, in the context of Europeana, and there are some people in the audience I know who were involved in that as well, we will discuss the impact framework that Europeana created, which is very much about how do we get beyond that pile of metadata? How do we really understand that the information that we're collecting, the metadata, the full content, if that's available for publication, how do we understand what it does to people, how people use that and reuse that? So first, a bit more about the Enumerate project. And I'll show you, this is a graph from the Europeana business plan. Europeana uses Enumerate to assess the work that we can do as a community together. So this iceberg, 90% that we estimated through our research in Enumerate is not digitized at all. So 10% in the past 15 years when we started digitizing our collections, we have more or less digitized about 10% of our collections. And I should say that's not a balanced value because we couldn't weigh small institutions with large institutions. We try to, but many institutions are not able to assess how big their own collections are, the physical collections are. So it's very difficult to assess what proportion you have digitized. So, but more or less it's about 10%, probably it's even a bit less. But that means that the majority of all the cultural heritage that we curate in Europe is not, in one way or another, available in a digital format. And that's say, a digital reproduction. We also asked how much of your collections do you really have available with the digital metadata? Have you described in your collection systems? 50% of all heritage in Europe curated by institutions is not available through metadata. So the half of these enormous pile of billions of objects that we have is just simply not accessible. And it's not even findable. We don't know that it's there. So when we set out to understand a bit more about the use of collections, we conceived a few questions on a high level in Enumerate that we could ask all the cultural heritage institutions across Europe. And there have been about 1,500 participants, 1,500 memory institutions supplied their information to our survey. And we asked them, what is your main driver to digitize your collection? So to create that offer, to create that push. And it's academic research and education, which may not be a surprise, which is valued quite high. So these numbers, they indicate, we ask them value on a range from 1 till 10. So 8.5 for academic research, that's a big driver for many memory institutions in Europe to digitize their collections. If you look at policymakers, more and more, they want to stimulate and advocate for creative reuse, for instance, by the creative industries. That's valued quite low by institutions as a driver for digitizing their collections. This is something that Harry will pick up in his presentation. Another thing we asked, and this relates directly, I think, I'm not sure it was Nick who said it, know your user. we asked them, do you do any kind of user survey? Do you do any activities or understand what makes people use your digital collections? Either on-site or remotely. And only 50% of the institutions do that. And it's not just small institutions. I think it was said this morning that the bigger institutions do that more frequently than smaller institutions. I think that may be true. But I think also many of the major institutions don't do any proper user survey. And it's even less, say, positive as it appears here, because of these 50%, so half of the institutions that do it, 90% only look at web statistics. So qualitative user surveys is only done by about 1 in 10 institutions. And how can you create value if you don't know what your users are, or what they want, and how they can, what their expectations are of what you have on offer? So this, I think this touches very much on a very critical point where we are with the digitization of cultural heritage, and that's why we try to raise this to a more strategic level. If you look at, say, the past 15 years of digitization, it was very much a bottom-up approach from institutions. People at communication departments, educational departments, project managers, they very much were eager to work with ICT as a tool to communicate with new user groups. And you saw that management was taking it a bit for granted for a long time. And only now we see that at the managerial level, the impact of all these digital activities, what I showed at the beginning, the influence of outside effects on the work that we do is increasing. So we're getting more and more to strategic choices. How do we invest our money? And maybe that's something we can pick up in a discussion afterwards. That was also one of the questions from the audience this morning. If you can spend your money only once, do you invest it in local digital experience? But what will happen once the exhibition is gone? You have invested in digital technology, in digital ways of presenting your collection. Will that be sustainable for a longer time to use those digital objects in a different context in the future? And a final graph I want to show you from Enumerate is we asked, how do you present your digital collection? And it may be, or maybe not a surprise, it may be a surprise to learn that about half of the collection that has been digitized, so of that 10%, half of that is not available through networks. Now that has of course everything to do with copyright, but it's also because it's a museum practice now to digitize objects on acquisition, so it's for their information management, internal information management in the institution, and it's not used for end user services. So about half of what we already have available in a digital way cannot be accessed through networks. The medium that's used mostly by institutions to present collections online is through their own website, which was also stated. Websites we may lose them in the future. They may not become so prominent again as a digital medium in the future. So there are two other channels which are getting more popular, as we noticed. The results that I show you are from the survey we did in 2013-2014. This was the third survey that we do. So we did 3 also to assess the methodology and to see how valid the data are that we have. And from the 3 surveys that we did, I can say that these are quite representative data from across Europe. And it's national aggregators which are quite growing in importance. The blue line refers to the situation now, the yellow line refers to the expectation, what it will be like in 2015-16. So you see there will be a growth from the national aggregators, which probably has to do also with the fact that many governments across Europe are very much pushing this forward, this idea of having a national aggregator as a way to make digital heritage and the metadata about it more accessible. And Europeana, which has a very good position, as you can see, that the expectation is that about currently 10% of what has been digitized is now available through Europeana, and that will double in the next years. The lower ones show that what really is needed as technology, as facilities, as intermediaries, as tools to make digital collections work on the web through social media or through other channels, that's only 3 to 5%. of the collections that are digital. So we're only just scraping the surface of what we have available in what we can achieve in accessibility and availability of our digital culture. I will hand over now to Harry. As you can see, Europeana has quite a good view among institutions to help multiply our digital content through different channels. And I leave it to Harry to pick up on this.
Thank you, Marco. While practicing this, I thought, wow, that's quite a bleak story. Thank you for that, because this is where you can find the report. If you believe that digital culture is something that has real potential on social relevance, on economic relevance, this is a very bleak story that you saw, because only a marginal part of our investment is actually recouping anything. Only 3 to 5% is reusable, as we call it. At Europeana, we try to change that equation. Europeana is a networked organization. We currently, about 3,000 institutions participate in it, ranging from the Louvre, the British Library, the big institutions, but certainly also very small institutions across Europe. We've collected about 36 million metadata records of digital culture. And the equation looks a bit like this. So from that small pile that Marco showed you, which was digitized, we have about 10%. And the good news is that that will likely increase to 18%. Fantastic. But more importantly, we're focusing on the licensing aspects and the reusability of that. So if you could look at that pie chart on the right, you see that already 35% is licensed for reuse, compared to only 2, 3, or 4% from the total pile. Why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this because this shows the ambition in Europe of institutions to make this material as widely available as possible. Open, you could call that. That's what we fundamentally believe in. And, you know, around this time of year, I always get a bit nostalgic, and that's not because of Christmas. But I'm a bit nostalgic for the time I worked in a for-profit company. Lots of reasons why I'm not nostalgic about that for the rest of the year. But what I liked about being in a for-profit organization, that at least it's very clear at the end of the year when the company is happy. We know how much money was invested in it, and if the output is higher than the money invested, or measured in free cash flow, or whatever kind of measurement we find, but at least it's measurable. We know when we've done well in a for-profit environment. Now, that is not the case if you work for a non-profit organization like Europeana is. And I'm thinking probably quite a few of you in this audience are working for non-profits. So then the question becomes, when are we happy at the end of the year? I'm very happy to work for an idealistic non-profit as Europeana. I believe I can change the world. I can do some significant and meaningful things. But how do I know what I'm doing well and what I can do better? And that's the question that I'd like to address with the impact framework. Now, to understand impact, we need to understand what strategy is. And more we understand that strategy is not what it was in the 1930s, when you could say, let's devise a 5-year plan and we'll figure out exactly what happened in the 5th year, and in the 1st year, the 2nd year, etc. The world changes way too fast in order for us to do that. So currently we look at strategy much more like a pattern in a stream of decisions we need to make. Every day we're confronted with new things that we need to change. So how do we make these decisions? At Europeana, we fundamentally believe that those decisions need to be taken based on our shared values. So we did some introspection as Europeana over the past year with our network, and these were the 3 things that came out as these are fundamental to every decision we take. If we understand these well, then we'll know when we're happy at the end of the year, when we make decisions that have real impact for us as an organization. So we're looking for things that are usable, reusable. That goes for material, that goes for all the content we're making available. The more content we make available that's usable for specific audiences, the better we've done. But we don't do that, look at that in isolation. We also feel that there needs to be a feeling of mutuality there. It can't be that we overprotect the rights of the creators or those of the end users. So when I talk about open, I talk about open in a context of mutuality that respects copyright. And we're also going to do that based on principles of reliability. We want to make sure that Europeana is the place where you go as a creative, as a teacher, as a person looking into their personal histories, and you want to know that this is the place that you can trust. So in that sense, we're trying to distinguish ourselves from many other services where you can find great content. So we took this into consideration, and we designed our strategies and our impact models based on this. So we also wanted to do this a bit more structured than sometimes we're used to. It won't be a case of let's do a bit more of this or a bit more of that. How can we evaluate the impact of our activities against real impact? And this is really fundamental for you to understand if you want to understand this impact framework. I think everyone in this world, as far as I know, in the past 5 years that I've worked here, we're usually way too happy when we start measuring outcomes in contrast to impact. When we know that we've had many visitors coming to our website, we usually say, that's great. We can stack up with the Metropolitan, we can stack up with Gallica or the British Library, we're done. And if we believe that the material needs to be reusable, we need to look outside of that. How many people were there through that effort connected, have a deeper understanding of how the world around them functions? Those are the type of things we're looking for. So we designed this framework, which looks huge on the screen. And it has 3 main anchors. The first one is a social one, the second one is a welfare one, an economic impact that we want to do, and the third one, an innovation and network one. And I'll take you through each of these fairly quickly. So if we want to know, did we do well in our mission to create impact on a social and cultural level? What are the types of things that we need to look for? An example of that is that we always use is the collection days that we're organizing on the theme of the Great War, the 1418 campaign, which culminated this year on November 11th, and I'm sure you've witnessed some of that. So we've invited people all over Europe to bring their artifacts from their attics, from their cellars, reminding them their family histories of the First World War. And it was an incredible, smashing success, I must say. Not due to us Europeana per se, but due to all the work from the network partners. And what we've seen is over 10,000 people across Europe so engaged in these stories that they were coming sometimes literally on the back of a horse, or at least on the back of a bus. They traveled for hundreds of miles to bring their collections and their stories and their diaries from their grandfathers, and they shared that with the rest of the world. So this for us is a very telling example of where we think we're doing fairly well on this level. We've got lots to learn everywhere else, but this is something we're going to continue doing.
We have some information.
Now, on the economic aspect, that is always a bit more difficult. We find it terrifically difficult as a non-profit organization to also talk about money. Money is usually a dirty thing. You need it, but you don't talk about it, right? We think that we have a moral obligation to also contribute on an economic level. That doesn't mean that we're after making money from the commercial environment, but we do think we have a responsibility to also contribute to a knowledge economy, if you want. So what we're looking for are what kind of things can we do to make sure that creatives across Europe reuse the material, build new apps, build new things that eventually lead to an improved state of welfare across Europe. So we've organized hackathons, challenges, dozens of them. We've selected the best of those developers, of those creatives, those entrepreneurs, and we've helped them. Sometimes we helped them quite a long way through an incubation program with business models, helping them find the relevant content for them, so that eventually we end up with things like this. This to me is a really one of my favorites, Europeana Beacon. I don't know if you're familiar with beacon technology, but I think it's going to have a huge impact in the museum world. It allows you to create applications on a much more granular level than your normal GPS tools would do. And it'll allow you on smart city level, like Siena is doing here, for example, to create new meaningful applications for people to walk through your city and experience the past. So we have about 200 of those now available on our website as examples of things that can happen. Europeana doesn't care if these things are per se creating money, but I think we are involved in making sure that these people are facilitated. And finally, in our impact framework, we're looking for things. How can we innovate the network of organizations that are part of Europeana? How can we create standards? How can we create shared platforms that will lower the cost and the barriers for entry for everyone to participate in this environment? And one of the things we've done is we're creating a cloud-based environment where everyone will have very low barriers to entry to participate. And we think that if we do these things well, these three things, then we're in a much better position to survive in this increasingly challenging world, including this one. I'd like to leave you with this quote, which I found from Albert Einstein, who's always good for a good quote, including this time. It's not about measuring, counting the things that you can measure. I think that's one of the big mistakes we're often making in this environment. The amount of people visiting your website are relevant, especially if they lead to people coming to your museum, but you want to know how much impact do you have outside of that world as well. How many people have shared that material, have engaged with it. So I'd like to leave you with this and then maybe open the floor for a bit more discussion on strategies. Thank you. Lina?
Thank you so much, Harry and Marco. Maybe we can just come here and stand, three of us. We don't need to sit and ask for questions. Is it... I have a question that it will be good to answer today. Which of the... so I don't need... Okay. Yeah. Okay. Which aspect of digital strategies is most crucial today?
I think there are a few, but one I already mentioned, I think, is involvement of people who really make decisions. And not only decisions in the here and the now, but also in the long term. That means I've been doing this type of work for 15 years, and I only recently found out, just 2 years ago, that I tried very much to get in touch with directors and staff with the management job in institutions. And I only found out that there's often a very conservative force behind that management team, which is the boards, which are captains of industries or whatever. And they often, I talked to the director of the M Museum in Leuven, which is a very innovative museum, and he said, I really would love to spend more money on more innovative activities, and he's not allowed by his board. So I think that we address this issue in a more consolidated way, that there is a strategic impact and there's a responsibility for long-term engagement and long-term sustainability of the digital things that we do. So that would be my first.
Yeah, I think that is crucial. I think what fascinates me most these days is can we find a balance between what's necessary on a macroeconomic level, where we feel that the investment we're making as society, and it's not negligible, the numbers that you showed, they represent 2 billion euros in investment in digitization across Europe. How can we make that as openly available as possible so that the barriers for entry for anyone will be as low as possible with microeconomic needs of an institution. The institution that Nick talked about needs to show that more people visit the museum. How can you do that in a digital environment?
Yeah, we have question there.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to ask about Creative Commons because that's one part of this European, and now museums have started to use make their own YouTubes and collecting music and so on. And I have made something, and I have always asked permission because instead there can be some danger with those fees and so. And then I found one music which had Creative Commons, and then I still decided to ask permission, and it was London Symphony Orchestra, and their music had been put on YouTube, and they said that it was very good. I asked because it would have been very expensive if we have used the music, though it was Creative Commons. They said that it was put illegally, and of course people use Spotify and everything, so actually how do we know that Creative Commons is reliable?
Yes, that's a great question. I think Creative Commons as an organization is agnostic to reliable or not. They have reliable licenses. Whether they're applied in the right fashion, that is hard to say. Actually, I think that's one of the roles that Europeana can play, is to make sure that when you find something labeled CC by SA on Europeana, that you can trust that that is the right label attached to it. It won't solve all the problems. We will still have problems of mismatches of labels on content. And I think we need to be very aware of that. I think we are currently much more in danger of losing relevance altogether because we're not open enough than the other way around, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So, yeah, take a bit of a risk once in a while. This was a good example when you shouldn't, but plenty of cases where you can.
Hey, I have another question. It relates to user-generated content. I would like to know what is part of the strategy of Europeana. How are you thinking in involving more people bringing their own objects and artifacts? I understood that you have done for this a special project, but it was content that was curated, right? For the World War I project.
Content that was curated?
Curated, that you select the objects that were, no?
No. This is basically everyone who brought their material, and it really ranged from a diary to a helmet type of thing. We took all of it in, and we didn't curate it.
But what is the idea? Is it so that all the time I can upload items in Europeana?
On the topic of 1418, yes, you can. And on 1989, and perhaps we're going to extend that. It is for us a bit of a difficult situation because I think you're pointing out, if we want to be reliable in the old world was easy for us. We say it's reliable because the museum or the library or the archive says it's reliable, we're going to trust that. And now there isn't that filter anymore with user-generated content. That's a difficult situation for us.
And what about the content that the users do, so the reuse? When they reuse Europeana content, are you publishing all that, or what is the policy there?
If they make something fantastic, I'll try to figure it out and I'll post it somewhere. But we're not actively tracking everything that's being done. I mean, to give you an idea, we have about 70 million social actions, if you want to call them, on Flickr, on Facebook, on Pinterest a year. I can't follow that. But we had a great example. Once in a while we have great examples. Like the other week, last week, we had Mashable. Do you know Mashable? It's a big internet platform, and they used collections from the 1910s, a Paris fashion show. And it generated over 20,000 visits to the website in a day. Those are the type of things that will surface and I'll show. Yeah.
Yeah, one more, and we have to continue with next session. So,
my question is how safe it is to be culturally critical through Europeana. And the World War I example was beautiful, it was sentimental and affirmative. But if people really wanted to express a tendentious opinion, a controversial opinion, and needed it to be anonymous, I'm tying this into the references to surveillance that came up through the Marianne's talk earlier on. But we're aware that there's a need for a space for debate and taking a stance, but also a need for some sort of digital privacy. And I'm wondering if this enters into any of your considerations.
Yeah, I think you should not look at Europeana as a place where the debate needs to take place. There are plenty of places which are better suited for that, and I support your opinion. You need that critical space. Europeana will not be a social network of that kind. Nevertheless, the content that we publish can also by itself be of controversial nature. We try to be as liberal and agnostic to that as we can. So, Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler will, as a book, I think we should publish. So unless in specific countries there are very legal, important reasons not to publish things, we will publish them if they're considered cultural heritage, if you want. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
thank you so much. The last one, okay.
So 90% of collections still aren't online. So do you think that getting collections and assets online is A, a thankless task, and B, if you haven't got any of your collections online, would you bother?
It's not even online, it's not being digital.
It's not being digitized.
Yeah.
So would you bother publishing that? Is it a thankless task trying
Okay,
to
yeah.
digitize all these collections?
I didn't show that, but that's also in our. We ask the institutions, how much of your collection do you think is worthwhile digitizing? And it's just over half of the collections. You see that museums tend to approach 90, 100%